Part 1. What he left behind. The sound I remember most is the click. Not the raised voices that came before it. Not the caseworker's careful practice neutrality on the phone the night before. Not even the silence of my sister, which by that point had weight and texture and presence the way a piece of furniture has presence. Something you moved around without thinking about it anymore, something that had simply become part of every room we occupied together. Just the click. Small, metallic. The deadbolt sliding home on the other side of the door. Final in the way that only small sounds can be final, the way a single period at the end of a very long sentence can carry more weight than everything that came before it. I stood on the cracked sidewalk outside the Henderson house with 4 black garbage bags sitting at my feet and a sky the color of old pewter pressing down on the rooftops of a neighborhood that had never been beautiful and had long since stopped trying. November in western Pennsylvania. The kind of cold that does not announce itself dramatically, but simply settles in occupying the air the way water occupies a container, finding every gap, every insufficiently protected place. Everything we owned in the world was in those bags. Bags meant for garbage. I have thought about that detail many times in the years since. The particular statement it made without intending to make it. The way the system, without malice, without even awareness, communicated something through the simple logistics of how you move children from one place to another. You arrive with nothing and you leave with garbage bags. The shape of your life fitting neatly into black plastic tied at the top stacked on a sidewalk. Beside me, my sister Wren stood with her backpack straps gripped in both fists, her knuckles pale from the pressure. She was 15 years old, and she had not spoken a single word in 7 years. Not since the accident. Not since a Tuesday evening in Ohio when she was 8 years old, and the world rearranged itself permanently around a drunk driver who ran a red light. She had been present for that rearrangement in a way I had not had seen, something that her 8-year-old mind could not process and could not release. And when the words stopped coming, they stopped completely. Not gradually, not partially, all at once the way a power line goes down in a storm. Present and then not. 7 years of silence. It had become its own language between us. I had learned to read the angle of her shoulders, the particular quality of her stillness, the way her eyes moved when she was frightened versus when she was simply absorbing. She communicated in notebook pages and gestures and the expressive precision of someone who has redirected everything speech would have carried into other channels. She was in some ways the most articulate person I had ever known. She simply did not use words to be that way. Now she stood on the sidewalk beside the garbage bags and stared at the front door of the house we had just been locked out of. The blue paint peeling around the frame, the brass knocker that had never hung quite straight, the thin crack in the lower pane of the side window. She was memorizing it. That was what she did with things that hurt her. She cataloged them with the thoroughness of someone who has learned that the world removes things without warning, and that the only way to keep anything is to preserve it somewhere the world cannot reach. She turned and looked at me. Her eyes asked the question she could not speak. I pulled the collar of my jacket up against the cold and made my voice as steady as I could manage, which was steadier than I felt and not nearly steady enough. "We'll figure it out," I said. "I promise." The most dishonest promise I had ever made. I had $47 and no plan, and a sister who trusted me with a completeness that made the air feel thin. 15 years earlier, in a city neither of us had ever been to, in an apartment that smelled of old coffee and machine oil, and the specific kind of loneliness that belongs to men who have outlasted their circumstances. A man named Henry Cole sat at a desk and looked at a stack of folders that represented the end of everything he had believed about his life. Henry was 51 years old. He had spent 23 years as a civil engineer, and he had been proud of that work in the deep structural way that certain men are proud of things. Not performatively, not loudly. The way a man is proud of something that he understands from the inside out. something he has given himself to completely enough to know its real worth. He had designed bridges. He had designed them to last, to carry more than they needed to carry, to withstand more than they needed to withstand, because he understood something that not everyone in his profession bothered to understand. Structures once built outlast the assumptions that built them. They carry weight that was never anticipated. They endure weather that was never predicted. They stand long after the engineer who designed them is gone, serving people that engineer will never meet. And they deserve for that reason to be built with room to spare. Every bridge was an act of faith. Every tunnel was a promise. He had believed that the way some men believe in Scripture. On his desk were two photographs. One was of his daughter laughing at something off camera at her college graduation. She had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness, a combination that produced a woman of considerable force, a force she had recently turned against him with a precision that was still raw enough to make him flinch when he thought about it. The other photograph was of two small girls, Nora, 5 years old, sitting on a porch step with her chin in her hands, already watching the world with those eyes that seemed to contain more understanding than a 5-year-old had any business having. And Ren, barely 2, a blur of motion at the edge of the frame, already in the process of going somewhere, already too interested in everything to hold still for a picture. His granddaughters. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked at the folders. He had spent 8 months assembling what was inside them. Falsified material certifications, fraudulent inspection reports, internal communications he had obtained through sources who were frightened and careful and who had come to him because they did not know who else to go to. Photographs he had taken himself at night at construction sites of concrete pours and reinforcement configurations that no responsible engineer would have approved. Pinnacle Group was one of the largest construction contractors in Pennsylvania. They had built roads and bridges and municipal infrastructure across the state for 3 decades, and they had grown very large and very powerful by learning a particular lesson about the construction industry. The most profitable part of building something is not the building itself. The most profitable part is the cutting. The careful, systematic reduction of material quality in ways that remain invisible to inspection if the inspectors are sufficiently motivated to look the other way. Henry had designed Creekside Bridge. He had designed it with the standards he applied to everything. Load tolerances that exceeded minimum requirements by a meaningful margin. Steel reinforcements specified conservatively. Concrete mixtures he had selected for long-term performance rather than short-term cost. His signature was on the engineering documents. Pinnacle Group had not built what he designed. They had built something that looked identical from the outside, something that passed every inspection it was subjected to because the inspectors were on Pinnacle's payroll in the quiet, systematic way that certain inspectors came to be on certain payrolls, in a state where construction contracts were large and political relationships were carefully maintained. The bridge bore Henry's name on documents that represented work he had not done, materials he had not specified, standards he would not have accepted. He had taken his evidence to the State Transportation Board, to the Attorney General's office, to every authority with jurisdiction over the matter, working his way through the appropriate channels with the methodical faith of a man who believed that correct procedure produces correct outcomes. Pinnacle Group destroyed him. They had better lawyers than he could afford. They had relationships with the very officials he was trying to reach. They buried his reports before they reached daylight, called him unstable and obsessive, dismantled his professional reputation with the efficient thoroughness of people who have done this before. They drained his savings through legal actions designed not to win, but to exhaust. And when he was still standing after all of that, still talking, still carrying his folders to anyone who would sit still long enough to listen, they made clear through the particular language of men who do not need to be explicit that the people Henry loved were not beyond their notice. His daughter had already been pulling away. She was frightened. She thought he had become consumed by something that was costing him everything and producing nothing. They had argued badly with a specific cruelty that close relationships produce when they go wrong, each of them saying things calibrated by years of knowing exactly where the other person was most vulnerable. When the threat came, it landed into a situation that was already broken. Distance became the only protection he could offer. He disappeared from the lives of everyone he loved. His daughter rebuilt her life without him. His granddaughters grew up with his name as a closed subject, a door their mother kept locked, something they learned not to ask about. Henry Cole went to a small apartment in Pittsburgh and sat with his photographs and his folders in the particular silence of a man who has lost everything except his conviction that he is right. He was right. He knew it the way he knew engineering, not with arrogance, with the quiet certainty of someone who has done the calculations carefully and checked them twice and knows what the numbers say. And so he started building. I did not know any of this when Ren and I sat in the caseworker's office the morning after the Hendersons locked us out. I did not know any of this when Mrs. Reeves pushed a manila envelope across her desk with the careful expression of someone delivering information they cannot predict the response to. The room smelled the way every CPS office I had ever sat in smelled. Stale coffee and floor cleaner, a combination I associated entirely with bad news delivered in professional voices. Children's drawings covered the walls in the bright primary colors of forced hope. Crayon suns, stick figures holding hands. Houses with perfect little windows and flowers that had never grown in any yard I had lived in. I looked at Mrs. Reeves, who had been our caseworker for 2 years, and who wore the specific exhaustion of someone who had once been idealistic and now carried the weight of everything that had happened to that idealism. She was not unkind. She was tired in a way that had gone bone deep. "This came for you," she said. "For both of you, technically. It's from your grandfather's estate." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Grandfather. I had not thought of Henry Cole in years. He had been a ghost for so long that thinking about him had started to feel like thinking about a character from a story that belonged to someone else. My mother's father, a man I had not seen since I was 5. I remembered him in fragments that felt more like physical sensations than actual memories. Rough hands, a deep voice, the smell of sawdust and oil. A kitchen table where he had crouched to my level and shown me how to build a small bridge out of wooden matchsticks, pressing each one into place with a patience that seemed at the time unlimited. "Keep building," he had told me. "That is the whole secret," and then he was gone. My mother never explained it. His name became weather in our house, the kind that closes a room down. I stopped asking. You learn which doors will not open, and you stop trying them eventually. When I was 7, a birthday card arrived with no return address. Inside, no money. A photograph of a bridge, a real bridge, some famous one I did not recognize. And in handwriting that slanted slightly to the left, 3 words. "Keep building. Henry." I kept that card for years in a shoebox under my bed. Then the accident happened. Then the foster care happened. The shoebox disappeared somewhere between our 3rd placement and our 4th lost, in the way that everything from before got lost piece by piece until before was just a country you used to live in. Now I held an envelope with his name on it, and he was dead. Inside was a deed for a small plot of land in a town called Grover's Hollow in western Pennsylvania. A handwritten note from the attorney described it as property of negligible commercial value, his sole remaining bequest after debts. Everything else had been liquidated. In a small cardboard box. Inside the box, on a square of yellowed cotton, a key. Heavy brass, dark with age, the kind of key that belonged to a world that built things to outlast their usefulness. Beneath it, folded tight, a piece of notepaper in handwriting that trembled at the edges, the marks of great age or great illness pressing into every letter. This key cost me $5 at a hardware store 30 years ago. It is the best investment I ever made. It opens the only thing of real value I have left to give you. Be brave. Henry. $5. That was our inheritance. a worthless patch of land and a $5 key and a dead man's instructions. I sat there in Mrs. Reeves's office with the crayon sons and the stick figure families watching from the walls, and I felt something I could not name, not grief exactly, something older and stranger. The ache of a connection that had been severed before it ever really formed, that had existed only as a closed door and one birthday card I no longer had, and now this small, cold key sitting in my palm like a question. Wren's hand found mine under the edge of the desk. The bus station was full of people who had somewhere definite to be. That quality always struck me about bus stations. The purposefulness of the movement through them. People with tagged luggage and confirmed reservations. Workers with duffel bags heading toward jobs that were expecting them. Students going home to families that would be waiting at the door. All of them moving with the particular ease of people for whom the question of where to go next has already been answered. Wren and I sat in bolted plastic chairs with our garbage bags stacked around us like a wall, and $47 between us and whatever came after this. 32 of those dollars bought the tickets, 15 remained. Wren had her notebook out and the worn one she had carried for years, its cover soft as cloth from handling its spine rebuilt with tape so many times the tape had layers. She wrote one word and turned the notebook toward me. Why? It was the right question. Why were we doing this? Why were we spending money we could not afford on bus tickets to a place neither of us had ever been to look at a patch of land the attorney had called worthless, based on nothing more than a cryptic note from a man we barely remembered? There were practical alternatives. There were shelters. There was Mrs. Reeves who would find us something probably eventually, something with four walls and a roof, even if it was not much else. But here was the thing about those alternatives. Every one of them was more of what we already had, more temporary, more other people's space, more waking up in rooms where nothing belonged to us, where the ground could shift without warning, where we were guests at best and burdens at rest. And here was a key, not a metaphor, an actual key heavy in my jacket pocket, pressing against my ribs like a small, cold fact. A dead man's $5 and the instruction to be brave. Because we have nothing to lose, I told her, and that was true but not complete. So I added the part that was harder to say. Because he left us something. Nobody ever left us anything before. And maybe there's a reason for it. Maybe he knew something we don't. It was paper thin. I knew it as I said it. Wren looked at me for a long time with those eyes that could read the inside of a face. Then she put the notebook away and leaned her head against my shoulder, and her weight was warm and real and full of the particular trust that had no business being placed in me and was placed there anyway, completely the way only people who have no other options learn to trust. I held on to that key all the way through the dark. 8 hours. The city dissolved, first giving way to the low-density sprawl of suburbs, and then to the open dark of the countryside where farmhouse lights appeared at long intervals, like small declarations of human presence in an otherwise empty landscape. Wren fell asleep within the first hour, her breathing slow and steady against my shoulder. I stayed awake and watched my own reflection in the window. A pale face superimposed over the rushing dark outside, a girl who looked older than 18, who had been looking older than her age for a long time now. I thought about Henry Cole. I tried to build him from the fragments I had. The rough hands, the deep voice, the matchstick bridge on a table in a kitchen I could no longer place, the birthday card I had lost. Keep building. The handwriting that slanted into a wind only he could feel. I thought about my mother's face when his name came up. That particular closing, the jaw tightening, the eyes going somewhere private and far away. She had never told us why. She had simply built a wall around the subject and maintained it with the consistency of someone who has decided a thing once and does not intend to decide it again. And now she was gone and he was gone, and whatever the story was between them, had gone with both of them died in the particular way that important things die when the people who carry them run out of time before they run out of reasons not to say them. He had sent one card in a lifetime of absence, a bridge and 3 words and a name. And now this key, this impossible inheritance. I fell asleep somewhere in the dark, miles past the edge of things I recognized, and I dreamed of bridges standing in rivers I had never seen, and Henry Cole standing beside them, looking at them the way a man looks at something he built with his own hands and his whole heart and is not ashamed of. We arrived just after dawn. The bus wheezed to a stop at a gas station canopy where the fluorescent lights were doing their inadequate best against the gray morning. The driver announced the stop with the specific tiredness of a man who has made this announcement many times and harbors no illusions about what awaits anyone getting off here. Ren and I stepped down into cold air that smelled of diesel, and beneath that something else, something clean and resinous and alive. Pine needles and damp earth and the particular atmospheric quality of a place that has been left alone long enough to develop its own character. After years of city air, it was almost disorienting, like stepping from a room where the windows have been closed too long into open weather. Ren inhaled beside me, deeply, deliberately, and for just a moment, just a breath's worth of time, the weight behind her eyes lifted. She looked around at the bare-treed hills and the pale sky and the unpretentious scatter of buildings along the highway with something that was not happiness exactly, but was in that neighborhood. Attention that was not anxious, presence that was not braced. I filed that away. It was the kind of thing I collected. The man behind the counter at the gas station was old in the way that certain men grow old, not diminished, but concentrated. His face was the color and texture of weathered hardwood, deeply grained, and his hands moved with the economy of someone who has long since eliminated every unnecessary motion from his work. He watched us come through the door with eyes that took careful inventory without appearing to take any inventory at all. His name was Ray Birch. He told me this after a pause, after I told him we were looking for property near Grover's Hollow. After I told him we had inherited it from our grandfather. After I said the name Henry Cole. Something happened in Ray Birch's face when I said that name. Not a dramatic shift. This was not a man who made dramatic shifts. It was subtle. A slight deepening of attention. A stillness that had a different quality than the stillness before it. Henry Cole, he said. Not a question. The way you say a name you have not said alone in a while, feeling the shape of it. He was our grandfather. Ray was quiet for a moment, looking at something in the middle distance between us and the door. Good man, he said finally. His voice had gone quieter, the way voices do for certain names. Ice storm of '09. Generator went down on a Friday night, middle of the worst cold we'd had in 30 years. Henry showed up at my door at 10 o'clock without being called. Worked till 5 in the morning. Got it running. Wouldn't take a dime. Wouldn't even stay for coffee. He paused. Good man, he said again, like the second saying was the real one. He gave me directions. The old service road past where the lumber mill used to be. Follow it until it got bad. Keep going past where it got bad. Stop at the abandoned rail tracks. Property would be right beside them. People around here call it Henry's Folly, Ray said. He bought it from the county, back taxes 10 years ago or so. Nobody could figure why. Nothing out there but scrub in the old right-of-way. He studied me with those careful eyes. You're his granddaughter. Yes. He nodded the slow nod of a man confirming something he has already concluded. Then he said something I did not understand the full weight of until much later. Well, if you need anything at all, I'm here most days. The walk took nearly 2 hours. The service road was a record of its own abandonment. Asphalt heaved and fractured by a decade of winters, the surface returning slowly to the earth beneath it, the way everything made by human hands returns eventually to something more fundamental if no one maintains the argument for its existence. The trees along the roadside had been stripped by November, down to their structures, every branch and fork and minor twig exposed against the pale sky complex as wiring diagrams stark as the truth. Wren walked beside me with her hands in her jacket pockets and her breath making small white clouds that disappeared almost before they formed. Out here, she was different than she was in the city, more alert. Her eyes moved steadily, taking things in with the focused ease of someone doing work that came naturally. She watched a crow cross the road ahead of us with the same careful attention she gave everything, cataloging it, adding it to the private archive she had been building for 7 years in place of conversation. A deer crossed ahead of us, a flash of brown and white that lasted 2 seconds and was gone before either of us could react. Wren grabbed my arm, pointed. Her eyes had opened with something I had not seen in them in a very long time, something unguarded and simple. Wonder. Just wonder. Just a 15-year-old girl surprised by a deer on a cold morning, briefly free of everything else. I held that moment the way you hold something that might not come again. We heard the rail tracks before we saw them, an openness in the air, a change in the acoustic quality of the landscape, a slight expansion of sound that resolved as we came around a bend in the deteriorating road into two lines of rusted steel, disappearing into the tree line in both directions. The wooden ties beneath them had been rotting for decades. Weeds had colonized the gravel bed with the patient confidence of things that know they have already won. Henry's Folly was right beside the tracks. I stood at the edge of it and understood immediately why people called it that. A small square of land, 50 feet by 50 feet at most. On one side, the dead tracks. On the other three, the dense wall of bare-branched woods pressing in close and different, ready to reclaim the few feet of open ground the moment no one was watching. The interior of the plot was a tangle of waist-high dead grass and dormant thorn bush, skeletal weeds that rattled dryly in the small wind. No structure, no cleared area suggesting a former structure. No foundation outline, no stone pile, no remnant of human purpose. Nothing. Just cold and weeds and the ghost of a railroad that no longer existed. Wren's hand found mine. Her fingers were ice cold. When I turned to look at her, she had tears running down her face in perfect silence, the way all her grief moved without sound, without the release of sound contained entirely within itself. She did not need to tell me what she was feeling. I was feeling it too. We had come all this way. We had spent money we did not have. We had followed a dead man's key and a dead man's instructions into the November cold of a place that wanted nothing from us and had nothing to offer. And it was this, just this. Weeds and cold and the hollow certainty that even from beyond the grave our luck had maintained its perfect consistency. I was already turning over the practical calculus in my head. Call Mrs. Reeves, ask Ray Birch about a shelter, figure out the next step the way I had always figured out the next step, one pragmatic foot in front of the other because no one else was going to do it. Then I saw it. I almost didn't. The angle had to be exactly right. The thin morning light coming from exactly where it was coming from, the gap in the dead vegetation created by years of settling and the patient work of small animals, and my feet placed on exactly the right square foot of cold ground. A flat slab of concrete, set flush with the earth at the center of the plot, nearly invisible, under the dead grass that had grown over its edges, and the accumulated debris of many seasons. Easy to miss. Designed I would later understand to be missed, and set into the concrete visible through a gap in the dead vegetation, a steel door. Not a cellar hatch, not a storm shelter cover. Something heavier than that, something that communicated seriousness in the way that well-engineered objects communicate it through the weight of their presence, through the precision of their fit. The door sat flush with the concrete with an exactness that spoke of care in the construction. On one side, a welded handle thick as my wrist. On the other, set into a housing bolted directly into the concrete slab, a padlock. The padlock was not old. Everything around it was weathered, rusted, worn by time and weather. But the padlock was new or close to it, heavy duty, double bolted. The kind that costs real money because it is designed to resist every kind of force that might be applied to it. It gleamed against the rust around it with the particular incongruity of something recently placed there. Someone had been here, not long ago. My hand was already moving to my pocket before the thought had fully formed. The key was between my fingers before I consciously decided to reach for it, warm from my body heat, heavier than it had any right to be for something that had cost $5 30 years ago. I pushed through the dead grass to the center of the plot and crouched beside the padlock and brushed away the dead leaves and frozen grit that had settled around the housing. My hands were shaking, not from cold. I put the key in, it turned. The sound it made was not the sound of a cheap lock giving up. It was the sound of precision. A heavy, solid, deeply satisfying mechanical report. The sound of something built to exacting tolerances, releasing exactly as it was designed to release. The bolt withdrew with a thunk that resonated in the concrete beneath my knees. I grabbed the welded handle with both hands and pulled. Nothing. I pulled harder, planting my feet against the slab, putting everything I had into it, and for one terrible, vertiginous moment, the door simply refused. Cold metal and years of settled earth, and the impartial resistance of a thing that had not moved in a long time and saw no reason to start now. Then something shifted. A sound came up from below. Deep and slow and reluctant, the groan of large hinges, waking from a long sleep, the sound of a door designed to last a very long time, doing exactly that and resisting every argument for opening. The door began to move, slowly at first, then with growing momentum as the hinges found their arc. Cold air rose over my face as it lifted, clean air. Cool and constant, carrying the smell of earth and stone and something else. Something sharp and faintly electric, like the atmospheric aftermath of a lightning strike. I propped the door against its hinges and looked down. Concrete steps, steep and precise, descending into absolute darkness. Beside me, Wren pressed close. Her hand found my arm. Her eyes were very wide, and in them I could see two things happening simultaneously. Fear, real and reasonable, the fear of darkness and of not knowing. And beneath it, pushing up through it, something else. She pointed down the stairs, then at herself, then at me. Together. I turned on my phone flashlight. The beam was weak and shaking. It found the steps and the floor at the bottom of the steps, and then the walls on either side, and those walls curved. Not a cellar, a tunnel, perfectly circular in cross-section, approximately 10 feet in diameter. The walls were smooth concrete, professionally finished, not crumbling, not leaking, not the rough work of amateur construction. This had been built to specification, engineered specification. The floor was dry and level and clean. The air temperature was constant and regulated in the way of deep underground spaces that have been isolated from the surface long enough to find their own equilibrium. This should not exist here. Not under a worthless half-acre plot of scrub brush beside an abandoned rail line in rural Pennsylvania. Not hidden beneath dead grass with nothing overhead but gray November sky. Not opened by a $5 key from a dead man's cardboard box. And yet, together, I said, we went down. At the bottom, I swept the light in both directions. To the left, the tunnel extended into darkness. My phone could not resolve, stretching away under the earth towards something I could not yet see. To the right, the tunnel ended at a concrete wall, perhaps 20 feet from the base of the stairs. Mounted to that wall was a gray metal utility box with a series of heavy switches beside it. The box had a padlock on it, a cheap one, this time the kind you buy at a hardware store without thinking too much about it. Leaning against the wall below the box, placed with the quiet deliberateness of something left to be found by someone specific, was a crowbar. I picked it up. My hands were shaking badly enough that I could feel it. 30 seconds with the crowbar. The cheap lock gave without drama. Inside the box, an envelope. Thick. the paper yellowed with age and the chemistry of sealed air. On the front, in the handwriting I recognized from the birthday card I had lost a decade ago, and the note paper I had read that morning in Mrs. Reeves' office in handwriting that slanted slightly to the left as if always leaning into something. My girls. I opened it. Inside was a letter. Not a single page. Pages. Written in the same careful, slightly trembling hand, small and precise, and covering every inch of the paper with the thoroughness of a man who has had years to think about what he needed to say and wanted to be sure he said all of it. I read by the weak light of my phone, crouching on the floor of an impossible tunnel, while Wren pressed close beside me with her warmth and her silence. And the world I had understood until that moment began quietly and completely to come apart and rebuild itself. He had been a civil engineer, a good one. He had designed bridges and tunnels and load-bearing structures, and he had done it with the pride of a man who understood what infrastructure actually meant. Every structure was a covenant, a promise made in concrete and steel to every person who would ever trust their way to it. He had taken that covenant seriously enough to document what happened when someone broke it. Pinnacle Group had been cutting corners on every major project in the state for years. Falsified material certifications, fraudulent inspection reports, bribery applied at every point where a human being had the authority to look the other way. The bridges Henry had designed were being built with materials he had not specified and would not have approved bearing his name on documents that did not represent his work. He had taken his evidence to the authorities. He had believed in procedure the way he believed in engineering. Correct input, correct output. He had been wrong about that. Or rather, he had been right about the engineering and wrong about the system. Pinnacle had better lawyers. Pinnacle had the right relationships in the right offices. They destroyed him methodically, professionally, the way large organizations destroy individuals when individuals become inconvenient. Blacklisted from his industry. Drained of his savings through legal actions designed to exhaust rather than prevail. His reputation disassembled piece by piece and left in pieces where the right people could see them. And when Henry was still standing, after all of that, still talking, still carrying his folders, they had communicated through the quiet language of implied threat that his daughter was not invisible to them, that the people he loved were not beyond reach. He disappeared. He did it to protect them. His daughter was already frightened, Roddy, pulling away, already believing that his fixation had consumed him past the point of reason. They argued, badly. The kind of arguing that happens between people who know each other's exact vulnerabilities and are frightened enough to use them. When the threats came, disappearing felt almost like mercy. The terrible mercy of removing yourself as a liability from the lives of people you love. When the accident took his daughter and son-in-law, Henry went to court for his granddaughters. He carried every document made, that every argument spent what remained on attorneys he could not quite afford. Pinnacle's reach found its way there too. Quiet whispers about an old man's stability, careful suggestions about fitness. The system operating with its characteristic, efficient indifference gave his granddaughters to strangers. Henry Cole went home. He sat for a while with his photographs. Then he made some phone calls about a piece of land in Millhaven. The tunnel had been a decommissioned utility conduit for the old rail line abandoned for decades, existing on no current map, noted on no active record. He bought the land above it from the county for back taxes, a small sum for a piece of ground nobody wanted, and then alone, working evenings and weekends and the long solitary hours of a man with a single purpose, for 10 years he built. He sealed the ends of the section. He installed ventilation that tapped into the old rail air shafts. He drilled a well. He ran shielded electrical cable from a forgotten junction that still carried current. He constructed walls of concrete block and salvaged lumber. He built rooms, actual rooms with actual beds under actual quilts, with a kitchen that worked, and a water system that filtered, and a generator that would run when it was needed. He did every part of it himself because anything involving another person left a record. and any record could be found by people who knew how to find things. He could not leave them money. Money could be taken. He could not leave them property in any form the system could identify. Property could be seized, but a place that did not exist on any map that sat beneath land no one wanted, that required nothing to find it but a $5 key and the willingness to go where a dead man pointed, that he wrote they cannot touch. He wrote, "I have loved you every single day since the day you were born. I have thought of you every morning when I woke and every night before I slept. I have built this place with 10 years of my life because it was the only way I had left to tell you the truth. You were never forgotten. Not for one day, not for 1 hour. Be brave, my girls. Be brave. Your grandfather, Henry." I sat on the cold concrete floor of a tunnel that should not have existed, and I wept in a way I had not wept since I was a child who still believed that weeping helped something. Not cried. There is a difference. Crying is the surface of grief. This came from somewhere deeper than the surface, from somewhere I did not know I had until it opened. The kind that shakes the whole body and takes the breath and leaves you feeling hollowed out and somehow impossibly more solid than before. Like something structural has been cleared of the debris that was obscuring it. I wept for the grandfather I had never been permitted to know. This precise and stubborn and ferociously patient man who had worked alone in the underground dark for 10 years, building something for two girls he was not allowed to see, on nothing but the faith that they would find their way to him, eventually, even if eventually came too late for him to see it. He had never given up on us, not once in 13 years. Wren wrapped her arms around me from behind and held on without making a sound, because she never made sounds, and her arms said everything that needed to be said. We sat together at the bottom of those stairs, two orphans, in the clean, cool dark, while above us the dead grass of November covered a door that a man had spent 10 years making worthy of $5 in a belief in things that endure. When the tears finally stopped, something else rose up through the floor they had been standing on. Not grief, something harder and cleaner and quieter than grief. We walked the tunnel with the flashlight and found what was there to find. 100 feet in the conduit opened into the wider space where Henry had built the rooms. The living area with its worn couch and its bookshelves and its low table where a coffee cup could sit. Two small bedrooms with cots and thick quilts and lamps that worked on stored power. The kitchen with its propane range and refrigerator and shelves of canned food and dried goods, laid in with the careful thoroughness of a man who had thought through every contingency. The bathroom, the utility room with its generator and its water filtration system and its pegboard of organized tools, and the metal cabinet at the far end. Inside it, a decade of evidence. Manila folders in meticulous rows, photographs, documents, reports, dates and names and locations organized with the precision of an engineer who cannot tolerate disorder even in his most private work. 10 years of watching Pinnacle Group continue what they had always done, getting better at hiding it, but never stopping, building structure after structure with falsified materials and corrupted inspections, putting thousands of lives on lines of credit against their own profits. At the front of the cabinet, a newer folder, a letter from Pinnacle Group dated 6 weeks before Henry's death. They wanted the land. $5,000 generous offer, negligible commercial value, luxury resort development, last remaining parcel. The final sentence underlined in red ink by Henry's hand: "Should you decline, we will petition the county to acquire the land via eminent domain." They were still trying to bury him, even after his death, even now, and they had no idea. To Pinnacle Group, this was a routine acquisition. The last untidy piece of a dead man's nuisance, a scrap of worthless ground they needed for a project. They had no reason to suspect anything lay below it. No reason to look. No reason to imagine that the man they had spent years destroying had spent those same years building something directly beneath their feet. I stood in the hum of the generator that Henry Cole had installed and wired and maintained through 10 years of solitary work in the clean, constant air of the home he had built for us underground, with the key in my pocket and the letter in my hand, in the particular crystalline clarity that sometimes comes when everything you understood about your own life turns out to have been only part of the story. I thought about Pinnacle Group and their $5,000 offer, and their eminent domain petition, and their lawyers and their relationships, and their 30 years of getting away with exactly this kind of thing. I thought about Henry Cole at his desk in Pittsburgh with his two photographs and his folders and his undefeatable conviction that he was right. He was right. Wren appeared in the doorway of the utility room. She had found the paint, a few cans of primer, and pigment that Henry had bought and left without explanation, without knowing quite why, except that he was building this for two girls, and maybe girls needed more than structure. Maybe they needed color in the particular way that people who have been given very little color for a very long time come to need it. She looked at me, then she looked at the curved concrete wall of the living area, blank and gray, and waiting. She opened the white primer without asking, dipped a brush, and began. Part 2, The Weight of Silence. She painted for 6 hours without stopping. I watched her from the doorway of the utility room, not wanting to interrupt whatever was happening, understanding instinctively that what was happening was important in a way that interruption would damage. Wren moved along the curved wall of the living area with the focused intentionality of someone doing work that had been waiting inside them for a very long time. First, the white primer, broad strokes covering the gray concrete in wide arcs. Then the colors building up from the base coat with a patience and a precision that I recognized from the engineering manuals on the bookshelves behind her. She was not making random marks. She was building something. The sun came first. Not a small sun, not a polite decorative sun of the kind that children paint in the corners of pages to indicate daytime. An enormous sun taking up most of the upper curve of the tunnel wall, its rays extending downward along the surface in long tapered strokes that caught the artificial light of the generator-powered lamps and seemed in certain angles to actually glow. Then trees. Not generic trees, but specific ones, different species rendered with enough care that you could distinguish them. Oak and pine and birch, their forms built up in layers, the negative space between branches, as considered as the branches themselves. Then birds. A whole sky full of them, moving in different directions, different altitudes, some near and large and detailed, others small and distant, reduced to the essential gesture of flight. Wings spread or folded or angled in the particular configurations of actual birds, doing actual things in actual air. Not the symbol of a bird, but the thing itself remembered or imagined with the accuracy of an eye that had been paying close attention for 15 years to everything it was given to see. She was painting the outside in. That was the phrase that came to me as I watched her. She was bringing the world above ground, down here constructing it on the walls of this underground space, with the same patient, systematic effort that Henry had used to construct the space itself. A man had built these walls to give us shelter. His granddaughter was covering them with sky. There was something in her eyes that I had not seen there in a very long time. Not happiness exactly, not yet. But the thing that comes before happiness in people who have been far from it. The quality of someone doing work that is true to them, that calls on the real parts of them rather than the defended parts. Purpose, maybe. The beginning of a reason to be present in a day rather than simply enduring it. I watched her and felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for years. When she finally stopped setting the brush down and stepping back to look at what she had made, the transformation was genuine. The living area of the tunnel, which had been clean and functional and unmistakably underground, had become something else. Not an imitation of the outside world. Something more like a memory of it or a promise. A declaration made in paint on curved concrete that the world above was still real and still worth believing in, even from down here, even in November, even with nothing but $47 minus 32 minus two coffees, minus a bag of crackers, and a problem we had not yet figured out how to solve. Ren turned and looked at me. Her face was paint-spattered and tired, and more alive than I had seen it in years. I did not say anything. Neither did she. We did not need to. The first week in the tunnel was a process of orientation, learning the systems Henry had installed with the thoroughness of someone who knew he would not be there to explain them. The ventilation ran on a simple timer that could be overridden manually, cycling fresh air through the old rail shafts at regular intervals, keeping the underground air from becoming the stale, close air of sealed spaces. The water filtration connected to the well he had drilled ran on a small dedicated pump that needed occasional checking but was otherwise self-sustaining. The generator consumed propane from a tank buried outside the entrance, accessible through a narrow secondary hatch he had cut into the concrete at the far end of the utility room. He had thought of everything. That was what kept striking me as I moved through the space and understood more of what he had built. Not just the broad strokes of shelter and food and power, but the small things. The reading glasses in the drawer of the coffee table beside the couch, two pairs different strengths, as if he had understood that we might have eyes that needed different help. The first aid kit mounted to the bathroom wall, stocked and organized with medical precision. The notebooks on the bookshelf, blank ones, a whole stack of them, as if he had known that words on paper might matter more here than words in the air. He had imagined us here. For 10 years, while we were being moved between houses that were never homes, he had been down here imagining us. Building a kitchen he thought we might cook in, choosing quilts he thought we might sleep under. Stacking blank notebooks for a granddaughter he had never met, but somehow from the photographs and the fragments in the fierce attentive love of a man who had nothing else to direct it toward, somehow knew. I thought about that at night in the narrow cot under the quilt that was thick and warm and had no institutional smell, none of the characteristic flatness of things laundered in bulk for strangers. I thought about Henry Cole choosing that quilt, carrying it down here, spreading it on a bed built for a girl he was not allowed to see. The grief would come in those moments, sudden and complete, and I would let it come because there was nowhere else to be and nothing else to do with it. Then the practical morning would arrive, and there would be things to figure out. The first trip into town happened on our third day. Grover's Hollow was 5 miles from the property by the service road, a distance I covered on foot in just over an hour each way. The town was small in the way of places that were once something else, that had a history of purpose that had gradually departed, leaving behind the infrastructure of that purpose and a population that had adapted to its absence. There was a diner that appeared to be open most days, a hardware store, a small grocery, the general store where Ray Birch spent most of his waking hours behind a counter that smelled of feed grain and machine oil and old wood. The first few times I came in, I was nobody. Another young woman picking up supplies, paying in cash, not staying long enough to become a face rather than a transaction. People in small towns notice strangers with the particular peripheral attention of places where the same faces have occupied the same spaces for decades. I could feel it, that noticing, but it was not hostile. It was simply observational. The fourth time I came into Ray's store, he had set something aside on the counter without being asked. A paper bag, day-old bread slightly past its best but entirely edible, the kind of thing that would otherwise go in the back. He pushed it across the counter when I came in, not looking at me directly. "For your sister," he said, "quarter for the lot." I paid the quarter without asking how he knew I had a sister. In small towns, information travels through channels that outsiders cannot map. I thanked him. He made a small, dismissive gesture that meant he did not want to be thanked and had not done it for thanks. The sixth time he asked my name, I told him. He went still. "Kellen," he repeated, and behind his eyes something was working. "Your mother's name was Kellen, before she married." "Cole," I said. "Her maiden name was Cole. Henry was her father." Ray looked at me for a long moment with those careful eyes that had already seen and cataloged everything about me before I finished walking through his door. Then he picked up the phone on the counter, dialed a number from memory, and said without preamble, "Dorothy, you need to come down to the store. Henry's granddaughter is here." Dorothy Marsh arrived 20 minutes later. She was 65 years old, small and upright, with white hair cut practically short and eyes behind silver-framed glasses that had the particular sharpness of a woman who has spent 40 years keeping track of 30 students at a time and has never lost the habit. She moved into Ray's store with the authority of someone accustomed to entering spaces and immediately understanding them, and she looked at me with an attention that felt like being read. "You're Henry's girl," she said, not a question. "His granddaughter." Same thing. She settled herself into the chair Ray had placed near the counter with the ease of someone for whom this chair was already familiar. "Your grandfather used to come to me for help with legal research, spent hours in my living room reading case law, taking notes in those small, careful notebooks of his." She paused. "He was fighting something. He never told me exactly what, but a man doesn't spend that many hours in case law books for no reason." I told her about the tunnel. I told her about the letter, about Pinnacle Group, about the decade of evidence in the metal cabinet, about the deed and the attorney's note and the $5 key that had opened everything. Dorothy Marsh listened without interrupting. Her expression throughout was unreadable, in the specific way of people who have learned to process information before responding to it, to let the full shape of a thing arrive before deciding what to do with it. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "There was a man named George Tilden. He worked with your grandfather at Pinnacle years ago. Henry mentioned him once in passing the way you mention someone you have thought about and decided you cannot rely on." She paused. "He said George knew where the bodies were buried." I waited. "Last I heard, he was at a care facility called Cedar Ridge, about 3 hours east of here." Her voice was measured. "He's old Nora, very frail from what I understand. But if anyone can corroborate what Henry documented, put a living witness behind those folders." She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. The letter from Pinnacle Group arrived 11 days after we found the tunnel. It came to the post office box I had set up in Grover's Hollow, the only mail address that could be attached to us without revealing where we actually were. The envelope was expensive. Heavy stock, cream-colored the return address printed in the restrained serif typeface of organizations that want to communicate stability and permanence. Pinnacle Group Development, Regional Acquisitions Division. Inside a single page, formal, polished. The language of people accustomed to getting what they want through the professional application of pressure. They were writing to inform the current landowner of parcel 7741-C, Grover's Hollow Township, of a significant development opportunity. Pinnacle Group was engaged in the construction of a premier resort and recreational complex in the region. The acquisition of the above-referenced parcel represented the final element necessary to complete the planned footprint of the development. They were prepared to offer $5,000 for a quick and clean transfer of deed. Generous, the letter said, for property of its type. At the bottom, a single sentence set apart from the rest of the text underlined, "Should you decline this offer, please be advised that we will petition the county to exercise eminent domain over the parcel for purposes of regional economic development." I read it 3 times. Then I sat with it for a while and thought about what it meant. They did not know. That was the thing. That was the entire thing sitting right at the center of every calculation I needed to make. Pinnacle Group was executing a routine land acquisition, the kind of thing their regional development division probably handled dozens of times a year. To them, parcel 7741-C was the last untidy piece of a project they were completing. A scrap of ground belonging to a dead man who had been, in their estimation, a nuisance they had successfully neutralized over a decade ago. They were not reaching for evidence. They were not trying to silence a witness. They were just tidying up, clearing the last loose piece from the board, the way large organizations routinely clear things that have outlasted their significance. They had no idea what was beneath that ground. They had no idea about the tunnel, about the rooms, about the metal cabinet full of 10 years of documentation. They had no idea that the land they were trying to acquire for $5,000 sat directly above the most comprehensive record of their crimes that existed anywhere. For the first time since a deadbolt had clicked home on a November morning and left us standing on a sidewalk with garbage bags and nothing else, I held something in my hand that felt like leverage. I wrote back a single line on the inside of the envelope they had sent. Not for sale. Dale Marsh arrived in Grover's Hollow 3 days later. He drove a black sedan that was too clean for these roads, a car that announced its own expense, with the quiet certainty of objects that cost enough to stop announcing themselves loudly. He wore a dark suit and a tie in a muted stripe and shoes that had never seen gravel. He had the face of a man who spent his professional life in rooms where the outcome was determined before anyone sat down, and who had learned to wear that certainty like a second skin. He found me outside Ray's store loading groceries into my backpack. He introduced himself with the professional smoothness of someone who has made many introductions in many adversarial contexts. Dale Marsh, Pinnacle Group. He had hoped we could discuss the property. There's nothing to discuss, I said. It's not for sale. His smile was thin and patient, the smile of someone accustomed to people who say no before they understand the full picture. He explained that $5,000 represented a significant premium for property of that type. That Pinnacle was being generous under the circumstances. That it might be in my interest to consider the offer carefully before making a decision I could not undo. My grandfather wasn't interested in your generosity, I said. Neither am I. Something moved in his eyes, not anger, something colder and more considered than anger. Recognition maybe, or the beginning of it, the first stirring of the awareness that this was not the routine acquisition his paperwork had suggested. He stepped closer. His voice dropped to the register of private conversation, the register that creates the impression of confidentiality while delivering something that is not confidential at all. Your grandfather, he said, made a series of very poor decisions in the later years of his life. He spent considerable time and energy pursuing a narrative that no credible authority ever validated. I would hate to see you make similar choices based on a dead man's obsessions. Is that a threat? It's context. He let a pause develop, the kind of pause that is itself a form of pressure. We have legal resources you cannot match. We have relationships in this county that go back 30 years. You are 18 years old with no income, no permanent address, and no legal standing to speak of. He paused again. What exactly do you think you have that can stand against that? I thought about the tunnel. I thought about the metal cabinet and its meticulous rows of folders. I thought about 10 years of documented evidence sitting 15 feet below the ground I was standing on, invisible to everyone who might want to find it. I have a home, I said, and I have the truth. He laughed. It was a short sound, clipped and without warmth, the laugh of a man who has heard many things said with conviction and watched most of them dissolve when they encountered reality. Truth it, he said, and the word in his mouth was the way a certain kind of man says it when he wants you to understand that he knows what the world actually runs on, and it is not that. He stepped back the conversation, concluding itself in his estimation. You have 30 days to reconsider the offer. After that, the eminent domain petition proceeds. The land will be acquired one way or another. The only question is whether you leave with $5,000 or with nothing. He walked back to his clean sedan without looking back. I stood on the gravel outside Ray's store and watched the taillights disappear around the bend in the road and felt something settle into place in me, something load-bearing and cold and very clear. They thought they were cleaning up. They had no idea they had just told me exactly where I stood. The threat arrived 2 days after Dale Marsh drove away. Not from Pinnacle directly. Smarter than that. A report filed with Child Protective Services. Anonymous or officially anonymous, in the way that certain reports are anonymous only in the paperwork, while everyone involved understands who made them. Two minors living on an unregistered property with no permanent address, no verifiable income, no adult supervision, potentially unsafe living conditions. A caseworker was scheduled to visit within the week. If they found the tunnel, if they determined that our living situation did not meet state standards for a minor child, Ren would be removed, returned to the foster system, placed wherever the system placed her, which would not be here, which would not be with me. I would lose my sister. I sat in the living area of the tunnel that evening, surrounded by Ren's painted sky and the steady warm light of the generator-powered lamps. And I tried to think clearly about a situation that made clear thinking difficult. The threat was not subtle. Pinnacle had identified the most effective lever available to them and applied it without hesitation. They could not force us off the land while the deed was clear. But they could take Ren. And without Ren, there was nothing to protect, nothing worth protecting, nothing that any of it meant. Ren sat across from me in the worn chair that had been Henry's, watching my face with the focused attention she gave to things that mattered. She could read my worry the way I could read her silence. She knew something was wrong before I said a word. She picked up her notebook. She wrote for a moment, not long. Then she turned the notebook toward me, and I read what she had written, and the letters were large and pressed so hard into the paper that the pen had nearly gone through. I am not leaving. This is our home. I will not let them take it. I looked at my sister. At the set of her jaw, the steadiness in her eyes, the quality of stillness in her, that was not the stillness of withdrawal, but the stillness of someone who has decided something and finished deciding it. For 7 years, she had retreated from language, from confrontation, from the full engagement with a world that had demonstrated its capacity to take things she loved without warning or apology. She had built a perimeter of silence and stayed inside it, surviving, enduring, painting what beauty she could find on whatever surfaces she was given, but always pulled back from the full weight of being present in a life she could not trust to hold. Something had changed. The tunnel had changed it. Henry's letter had changed it. The knowledge, sudden and complete and transforming, that she had been loved this whole time, that someone had spent 10 years building a place for her, specifically for her and for me, out of a love that refused to be extinguished by distance or time or the systematic malice of people with lawyers and money and reach. She had been loved, and now she knew it, and she was not going to let anyone take the place that love had built. I looked at those words on the notebook page, the capitals pressed hard enough to score the paper, and felt something shift in the architecture of my fear. Not disappear, shift, redistribute. I was not carrying this alone. I had never been carrying it alone. I just had not known that until now. We'll fight it, I told her. She nodded once, the nod of someone for whom this was already settled. Dorothy Marsh, it turned out, had more than historical knowledge of Henry's situation. When I described the CPS threat, she did not look surprised. She looked instead like someone whose calculations had just been confirmed. She was already reaching for the phone when I finished explaining. There's an attorney in Harrisburg, she said, Carol Briggs. She does civil rights work, the kind nobody else wants. Your grandfather contacted her about a year before he died. Send her a box of his documentation. She dialed from memory. She'll remember his name. The call took 4 minutes. Carol Briggs did remember the name. Her voice on Dorothy's speakerphone was precise and unsentimental, the voice of someone who had been disappointed by the law often enough to have made a separate peace with it. She said the statute of limitations had passed on most of Henry's original claims. She said the original case had been old even when he first brought it to her. She said she was very busy. There's new evidence, I said. 10 years of it. A pause. Environmental violations, I continued. Fraudulent billing on recent projects. Bribery documentation with current dates. And they're trying to take our land. The same organization that destroyed him is now coming after us through eminent domain, and when that wasn't moving fast enough, They filed a CPS report to threaten my 15-year-old sister. Another pause. Longer. You're living on his property. Underground, I said, in something he built, which they don't know exists. The silence on the line had a different quality now. I could almost hear the attorney's mind rearranging its assumptions. Bring me the documents, she said finally. All of them. I'll look at them. No promises. 2 days later, I was in Carol Briggs's office in Harrisburg with a backpack full of manila folders and the particular feeling of someone who has carried something heavy a long way and is finally setting it down on a surface that might be strong enough to hold it. Carol Briggs was 53 years old with steel gray hair cut close and eyes that could find the structural weakness in an argument the way Henry had found the structural weaknesses in a falsified inspection report. Her office was small and crowded with the organized clutter of someone who processes large volumes of complex information and has developed systems for managing it that are legible only to themselves. She read for nearly 2 hours. I sat in the chair across from her desk and watched her read. Her expression remained professionally contained throughout, but I learned to interpret the small variations. The slight tightening around her eyes when she found something that mattered. The occasional pause where she read the same section twice. The one moment about 40 minutes in where she set the folder down briefly and said something very quiet that I was fairly certain was a word she did not normally say in professional settings. When she finally looked up, her voice was quiet. Your grandfather was meticulous, she said. Everything is documented, cross-referenced, dated. She tapped a folder of photographs. These are the construction documents for Creekside Bridge, built 8 years ago. According to these notes, the material certifications were falsified, the safety inspections were conducted by inspectors with demonstrable financial relationships with Pinnacle Group. She paused. If his analysis is correct, that bridge is compromised, not theoretically, actually, right now. Can we use this? She leaned back in her chair, the chair of someone used to holding the weight of other people's worst situations. The environmental violations are recent enough to be actionable. The fraudulent billing patterns are consistent enough to suggest systemic practice rather than isolated incidents. The bribery documentation, if it can be corroborated by a living witness, becomes the foundation of something that could go very far. George Tilden, I said. He worked with my grandfather at Pinnacle 30 years ago. He may have his own documentation. Carol's eyebrows moved. Tilden. Yes, Henry mentioned him in his initial contact with me, said he was the only other person inside who had seen everything. She paused. He's very old, Nora. Even if he agrees to speak, his health may not. I know, I said. I still have to try. She looked at me for a moment with the assessing gaze of someone recalibrating an estimate. Yes, she said, I suppose you do. Cedar Ridge Care and Rehabilitation was a low building set among grounds that had been designed to suggest peace and had achieved something closer to resignation. The gardens were tidy and colorless in November, the paths between them empty at mid-morning. The lobby smelled of institutional warmth and the specific combination of cleaning product and something underneath it that no amount of cleaning product entirely covered. George Tilden was in a wheelchair beside the window of a common room that looked out over one of the tidy, colorless gardens. He was old in a way that had moved past category, past the phase where age is still a count of years, and into the phase where it is simply a condition, a state of being that has its own dignity if you let it. His hands lay in his lap with a tremor that was constant and fine like a small, persistent signal. His eyes were clouded at the edges, the opacity of cataracts not fully treated, but they were tracking. They were present. I sat down across from him and said my name. He listened. Then I said the name, Henry Cole. The tremor in his hands did not stop, but something in his face changed. The opacity in his eyes shifted, some interior focusing happening behind the clouded surface. And for a moment, he looked less like an old man in a wheelchair by a November window and more like the person he had been before all of it, before the years and the silence and the long accumulated weight of a choice made badly a long time ago and carried ever since. Silas, he said, his voice was thin, worn to near transparency by age, but the name came out of it with a weight that suggested it had been sitting there for a long time waiting. Then he corrected himself. Henry, I keep thinking of him as Silas for some reason. Never mind, old man's confusion. I'm his granddaughter. I know who you are. He turned his wheelchair slightly to face me more fully, and the movement was slow but deliberate, the movement of someone who still directs their own attention. He showed me your photographs. Years ago, before he and I stopped having the kind of contact that was safe, he talked about you, both of you. A pause. I didn't think it would be you who came, though. I thought it would be a lawyer or a journalist, not a girl. I'm 18, I said. I know. He was quiet for a moment. You look like him. Around the eyes. He told me everything. Not quickly, not in the ordered, efficient way of someone recounting a prepared statement. The way of someone who has held something for 20 years in the deepest part of themselves, who has lived with it through sleep and waking and every day that passed after the day they made the choice they made. It came out slowly, following its own internal order, the order of a man reviewing his own history with the particular honesty of someone who has decided that the time for protecting himself from it has finally passed. He had been an engineer at Pinnacle, not as senior as Henry, not the kind of engineer whose name went on the final documents, but present at the working level where the actual decisions got made, where the specifications got written, and the material orders got placed. He had seen the substitutions, not once, not occasionally, systematically, as a matter of operating procedure. The good materials went in the budget, the cheaper materials went in the structure, and the difference went somewhere that he had eventually understood was not an accident or an oversight. When Henry began to document and to push, George Tilden had been given a choice, not explicitly, not in any way that would have left a record. But the choice was made clear in the way that certain choices are made clear in organizations that do not need to be explicit, through the particular silence of people who look away and the particular attention of people who want to make sure you understand what looking away means for your future. He had a family, a mortgage, a daughter starting college. He had made the calculation that millions of people make when something is wrong, and the cost of saying so is concrete, and the benefit of saying so is abstract. He had stayed silent. He had watched Henry get destroyed. He had told himself it was not his fight. He had been wrong. I kept copies, he said. His voice was very quiet. Everything they made us sign, everything they made us certify, I've had it in a safe deposit box for 20 years. He looked at me with those clouded, prescient eyes, waiting. For what? The silence between us was full of the weight of decades and the specific gravity of choices not made. For someone brave enough to finish what Henry started, he said. Are you brave enough? I thought of Wren painting a sun on a concrete wall underground. I thought of Henry Cole working alone in the dark for 10 years on nothing but faith that it would eventually matter. I thought of the notebook and the letters pressed so hard they nearly cut through the paper. Yes, I said. He nodded the slow nod of a man satisfied with an answer he had been waiting a long time to hear. The notary came to Cedar Ridge 3 days later. George Tilden signed the affidavit with a hand that shook but did not stop applying his signature to a document that corroborated every significant claim Henry had made and added to them the weight of a living witness's first-hand testimony. But it was what else was in George's folders that changed the dimension of everything. The documents he had kept were not only confirmations of the original crimes from 30 years ago. They included materials he had obtained carefully and quietly in the years since. Internal communications, memos routed through channels he still had access to, through contacts who had their own long memories and their own uneasy consciences. And at the center of them, appearing on page after page in the careful documentation of a man who had spent 20 years watching and waiting and keeping records, a single name, Warren Pinnacle III. the current chief executive, the third generation of the family that had built the company and the third generation to run it. His signature appeared on the falsified certification documents for Creekside Bridge. His handwriting was on the internal memo authorizing the material substitutions. His name was on the payment orders for the inspectors. This was not a rogue project manager cutting corners to make his budget work. This was not middle management operating below the awareness of leadership. Warren Pinnacle III had personally directed the construction of a bridge he knew was compromised, using materials he knew were inadequate, authorized by inspections he knew were fraudulent. This was not corporate negligence. This was criminal conspiracy, directed from the highest level, documented by two engineers who had been there when it happened. George Tilden died 2 days after he signed the affidavit. Peacefully, they said, in the night in the room he had occupied for 3 years beside the window that looked out over the tidy, colorless garden. The nurse who found him in the morning said he looked as though he had simply decided he was finished and gone. I believed that. I believed he had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and that the carrying of it had been in some ways the thing keeping him upright, the weight that gave him a reason to persist. And when he had finally set it down, when he had placed his trembling signature on a document that transferred its weight to someone else, something essential had departed with it. I hoped he had felt light. I hoped whatever he felt in those last hours was lighter than anything he had felt since the day he made the wrong choice and decided to live with it. Back in the tunnel, Ren had kept painting. The sun on the main wall had grown more complex, its rays developing into intricate patterns that seemed to move in the lamplight. She had started on the corridor leading to the utility room, covering the curved walls with a landscape that continued seamlessly from the living area, as if the tunnel were simply a window looking out onto a world of her own construction. A world with trees and birds and a sky so deeply blue that standing in the corridor sometimes produced a sensation close to vertigo, as if the ground had become sky and the sky had become something you could fall into. She had started leaving the paint supplies out rather than putting them away, which meant she was planning to continue, which meant this was not a project but a practice, not something she was doing, but something she was becoming. She was an artist. She had always been an artist. She had just never had walls big enough before, or a reason that felt permanent enough, or the understanding that the walls belonged to her and could hold whatever she needed them to hold. I watched her work and I thought about the week ahead and what Carol Briggs had said when I called to tell her about George Tilden's testimony. She had been quiet for a long moment. Then she had said, "This is bigger than a land dispute, Nora. This is bigger than your grandfather's original case. If that bridge is as compromised as the documentation suggests, the public safety dimension alone will get attention that nothing else could buy." Another pause. "I'm going to file for an injunction on the eminent domain petition, and I'm going to make some other calls." "What kind of calls?" "The kind," she said, "that I haven't been able to make before because I didn't have enough to back them up." I stood in the tunnel and listened to the hum of the generator and the soft sound of Wren's brush against the wall, and I thought about Henry Cole working alone down here, in this same hum, this same contained air, building rooms that would one day hold people he loved but could not see. He had believed it would matter. He had built on that belief for 10 years in the dark without evidence that it would ever be enough, without any way of knowing whether the day would ever come when the folders in the metal cabinet would be opened by someone who could do something with what was inside them. He had been right. It was going to matter. I walked to the utility room and opened the metal cabinet and stood in front of the meticulous rows of folders for a long moment. 10 years of a man's work. 10 years of watching and documenting and waiting with the patient, stubborn faith of someone who believes that truth has a destination, even when it is taking an unreasonably long time to get there. I thought about Warren Pinnacle III in his office somewhere signing documents and taking calls and operating inside the comfortable assumption that the loose ends from 30 years of his company's criminal history had been thoroughly managed, that the man who had tried to expose him was dead, that the land that might have connected anyone to anything was about to be acquired through the clean legal mechanism of eminent domain handled by the Regional Acquisitions Division as a routine line item. He had no idea. He was about to find out. Outside through the concrete and the earth and the dead grass of November, the cold was settling in for another night. In a room 3 hours east of here, a man who had carried a wrong choice for 20 years had finally set it down. In a Harrisburg office, an attorney was making phone calls she had not been able to make before. And in a tunnel under a worthless half-acre plot in western Pennsylvania, a 15-year-old girl who had not spoken in 7 years was painting a sky so blue it hurt to look at. On the walls of the home her grandfather had built for her, in the light of the generator he had wired alone in the dark, and the color she laid down was the color of something that has been kept underground a very long time and is finally, with great patience and great stubbornness, and the irreducible force of a love that refuses to die, beginning to come into the light. Part 3: Home. The engineers arrived on a Tuesday, 3 of them in a state vehicle that parked at the near end of Creekside Bridge at 7 in the morning and did not move for 6 hours. Carol Briggs had filed the safety concerns with the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation the same day she filed the injunction against the eminent domain petition attaching a selection of Henry's documentation, the photographs, the material certifications, the inspection records, with the financial relationships between the inspectors and Pinnacle Group, footnoted in Henry's careful slanted hand. The department had responded faster than Carol expected. I was not there to watch. I learned about it afterward from Dorothy Marsh, who had a friend who worked in the county planning office who had heard from someone else, which was how information moved in Grover's Hollow through a network of relationships so long established and so thoroughly maintained that news traveled through it with a speed and completeness that would have impressed any formal system. What the engineers found was exactly what Henry's documents had predicted. The support columns showed cracking in the load-bearing sections fine at the surface but deep when probed, the kind of cracking that develops from the inside when the concrete aggregate does not meet specification. The steel reinforcement in the sections they could access showed corrosion that should not have been present in an 8-year-old structure, the oxidation pattern consistent with substandard alloy composition rather than environmental exposure. The deck surface, examined at the joints, showed evidence of differential settling that suggested the substructure was not behaving as a uniform system. The bridge was closed by noon on Tuesday, not scheduled for review, not flagged for monitoring. Closed. Orange barriers across both approaches and a state police vehicle parked at each end, and a terse departmental statement about precautionary measures pending full structural evaluation. By Wednesday morning, the structural evaluation team's preliminary findings were in the hands of the department head. By Wednesday afternoon, they were in the hands of the Attorney General's office. By Thursday morning, 2 journalists had the story, and by Thursday evening, it was on the regional news with the particular velocity of stories that contain both government failure and public danger stories that answer the question every viewer is always asking underneath every other question, which is, could this happen to me? The answer in this case was yes. Engineers quoted in the coverage said that had the bridge failed during peak traffic hours, the death toll could have exceeded 200 people. Henry Cole had known that. He had known it for 8 years since the day the bridge opened, and he stood at a distance and looked at the thing bearing his name that was not what he had designed, and understood that it was a death sentence written in concrete and steel waiting to be served. He had tried to prevent it. He had been destroyed for trying, and then unable to prevent it and unable to stop knowing what he knew he had done, the only thing left to him. He had documented it. He had kept documenting it for 10 years, updating his files as the bridge aged, and the evidence of its deterioration became increasingly legible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. 200 people. That number sat in me like a stone. I thought about it at night, lying in the narrow cot under Henry's quilt, while the ventilator cycled quietly, and Wren's painted sky surrounded me in the lamplight. 200 people who did not know they had been driving over a structure that was slowly and visibly failing. 200 people who had trusted in the way that people trust infrastructure, which is to say completely and without thought, the way you trust the ground under your feet, that the thing holding them up had been built to hold them. Henry had tried to warn them. The system had called him unstable for trying. Carol Briggs called me on Thursday evening from the road, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone who is moving fast and thinking faster. The Attorney General's office has opened an investigation, she said. They're moving quickly because the bridge closure created public pressure that makes moving slowly politically untenable. They're going to want the full documentation. A pause where I could hear a turn signal. Nora, what your grandfather built in those folders is going to be the foundation of a case that goes significantly higher than anyone currently expects. I need you to understand that what happens next is going to become very public. I understand, Oishaye. Pinnacle Group is going to fight hard. They have resources, and they will use all of them. They're going to try to discredit the documentation. They're going to try to discredit your grandfather. They may try to discredit you. Let them, I said. Another pause. When she spoke again, her voice had a different quality, something slightly less professional and slightly more human. Henry was lucky in his granddaughters, she said, even if he didn't know it in time. I did not trust myself to respond to that. I thanked her and ended the call and sat in the quiet of the tunnel and let the weight of it settle through me until it found its level. The night before the first major hearing was the night they came. It was past midnight. The tunnel was in its nighttime quiet, the generator running at low power, the ventilator cycling on its slow rhythm. Wren was asleep in her room, her breathing audible through the thin, salvaged lumber wall between our spaces, slow and steady. I had been lying awake in the particular state of sleeplessness that is not restless, but simply alert, the body too aware of what tomorrow held to fully release into unconsciousness. I heard the footsteps through the steel door and the concrete above me. Not imagined footsteps, real ones. The particular quality of weight on ground transmitted down through earth and slab, recognizable once you have learned to recognize it. Then voices low and indistinct, the kind of voices people use when they think they are unobserved. Then unmistakably the beam of a flashlight sweeping across the ground, above, visible through a hairline gap where the door's hinges met the frame on the inside. I moved to the stairs without waking Wren. I climbed slowly, placing my feet to the sides of the concrete steps where they were less likely to transmit sound. At the top, I pressed close to the door and looked through the gap. 2 men, moving methodically around the perimeter of the property, sweeping their flashlights across the ground with the focused attention of people who are looking for something specific. One of them crouched near where the surface of the concrete slab was visible through a gap in the dead grass, and I felt my breath stop entirely. The other one had moved to the small structure Wren and I had begun building over the entrance, a rough cabin frame barely framed out just enough to provide a surface plausibly explaining why anyone might be on this property. He was trying the door handle. The cold settled in through the steel. I had no phone signal this close to the door. No way to call anyone. Nothing between me and 2 men with flashlights and intentions I could infer, but not confirm, except a steel door in the darkness below me and the specific paralysis of someone who has thought through many scenarios, but not quite this one. Then a voice cut through everything. You boys lost. It came from the tree line to the north. A flat voice, not loud. The kind of voice that does not need volume because it carries something more authoritative than volume. The kind of voice that has spent decades being exactly as serious as it sounds. Ray Birch stepped out from between the bare trees. He was 70 years old, and he moved like a man who has never in his life needed a hurry to communicate that something important was happening. He was wearing a heavy canvas coat and a wool cap, and he carried a shotgun in the crook of his arm with the casual confidence of someone for whom a firearm is a tool rather than a statement, something as natural to hold as a wrench or a level. This is private property, he said. His voice was the same temperature as the November air. "I've been sitting out in those trees since 9 o'clock, waiting to see if anybody was going to be stupid enough to come out here tonight." He paused, letting that settle. "Looks like somebody was." The two men looked at each other. There was a brief calculation visible even from my angle of observation, the rapid assessment that happens when people who expected an unoccupied piece of ground in the dark find instead a 70-year-old man who shows no sign of being uncertain about the situation. They left, quickly without speaking back the way they had come, their flashlight beam bobbing and disappearing into the tree line to the south. Ray watched them go until the sound of their movement faded completely. Then he turned toward the steel door, toward the precise location where I was standing in the dark behind it, as if he had known exactly where I was the entire time. "Get some sleep," he said, not loud, not gentle, just level in the voice of someone who has decided how the night is going to go and sees no reason to discuss it. "I'll keep watch till morning." I stood behind the steel door in the dark and breathed. I had not asked Ray Birch for anything. I had not called him. I had not told him about the hearing the next morning or the men from Pinnacle's investigative division or the particular vulnerability of this night. I did not know how he had known to be there, though I suspected the network that moved information through Grover's Hollow had carried something to him, some piece of awareness, some sense of what the night might require. He was 70 years old. He had earned every right to be at home in his warm house behind a locked door with no particular obligation to anyone. He did not owe us protection. He did not owe us anything. He owed Henry Cole a favor from an ice storm 17 years ago, and he had decided in the quiet arithmetic of a man who keeps his accounts carefully that this was the night to pay it. I thought about what it means to live in a community. Not the idea of community, not the word, but the actual lived substance of it. The way it manifests not in declarations or ceremonies, but in specific acts. A man standing in a cold tree line at midnight with a shotgun because the granddaughter of someone who once helped him was alone in the dark and might need someone to stand between her and the people who wanted to take what she had found. That is what a community means. Not obligation, choice. The specific, deliberate choice to show up when showing up costs something. I went back down the stairs. I lay in the cot under Henry's quilt and listened to Ray Birch's measured footsteps on the ground above me, slow and patient walking the perimeter of the property with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who has decided to do a thing and intends to do it correctly. I fell asleep listening to those footsteps, and for the first time in a very long time, the sleep that came was not the sleep of someone braced for the next thing. It was the sleep of someone who was for the moment held. Dale Marsh came back one final time. It was 11 days after the bridge closure. The Attorney General's investigation had expanded in scope 3 times in those 11 days, each expansion generating its own coverage, its own momentum, its own accumulation of documentary evidence from sources that seemed to be emerging now that the first sources had established that emerging was possible. People who had stayed silent for years for the same reasons George Tilden had stayed silent were finding that the silence had become less sustainable than the alternative. Marsh found me outside Ray's store in the middle of the morning. He did not look the way he had looked the first time. The suit was still expensive, but it sat differently on him now, as if the body inside it had changed its relationship to the clothes. The controlled assurance he had carried like a second skin 3 weeks ago was still present, but thinner worn in places, the kind of surface that is maintained by effort rather than generated by ease. There were shadows under his eyes that had not been there before. He was afraid. I recognized it because I had spent most of the past month with fear as a close companion and had learned its particular signatures. He had the stillness of a frightened person who is working very hard not to show fear to someone they need to think them in control. $500,000, he said. No greeting, no preamble. The directness of someone who has moved past the stage where social forms serve any purpose. Cash, off the books. You and your sister walk away, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and Pinnacle will manage the remainder of the situation through appropriate legal channels. He paused. You can go anywhere. New names if you want them. College, a real house, everything two girls in your situation could need to start over completely. $500,000. I want to be honest about what happened inside me when he said it because the honest version matters more than the version where I immediately and certainly knew what I would do. For a moment, for several moments, I thought about it. I thought about what $500,000 would mean in real specific terms. College without debt for both of us. A real house with real walls and a deed that had our names on it, and no corporation threatening to acquire it through legal mechanisms we could not afford to fight. Security of a kind we had never experienced, the kind that changes your relationship to every morning you wake up in, because the first question of every morning, the question of whether the ground is still there, has already been answered. I thought about Wren, about the years she had spent silent and unhoused and moved from place to place. And I thought about what $500,000 could give her that she deserved to have and had never had. I held that thought long enough to feel the full weight of it. Then I thought about Henry Cole. I thought about him in his small Pittsburgh apartment, looking at the photographs of two little girls he was not allowed to see, deciding to begin the decade of work that would end in an underground home built out of pure, stubborn love. I thought about what it must have been like to work down there in the dark alone night after night, year after year, on the faith that it would eventually matter, that someone would eventually come, that the truth he was keeping had somewhere left to go. I thought about George Tilden's trembling signature on an affidavit and what it had cost him and what it had freed him from in the last 2 days of his life. I thought about Creekside Bridge closed now behind orange barriers and the engineer's preliminary estimate of 200 lives at risk, and I thought about the fact that those 200 people had families, that the families had mornings, that the mornings continued because a dead man had kept documenting even when no one was listening. My grandfather lost everything trying to tell the truth, I said. I'm not going to sell it. Marcia's face did not collapse. It was not that kind of face. But something in it changed something that had been held under professional pressure, releasing slightly, and what it released into was not rage or bluster, but something closer to exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who has been asked to do something distasteful and has done it, and it has not worked, and he is going to have to go back and report that. You're making a mistake, he said. Maybe, I said, but it's mine to make. He looked at me for a moment with the complicated expression of someone seeing something they did not expect in a place they expected. Nothing complicated. Then he turned and walked back to his clean sedan and drove away, and I watched him go and stood in the gravel outside Ray's store in the cold morning air, and felt the particular quiet that follows a decision that cannot be taken back. 1 week later, federal agents arrested Warren Pinnacle III at his home in suburban Philadelphia. Pinnacle Group filed for Chapter 11, bankruptcy protection 23 days after that, the morning the bankruptcy was filed. I was in the tunnel sitting on the worn couch in the living area surrounded by Wren's painted sky, reading the news on my phone, and I felt something that I had expected to feel as triumph and discovered instead was something quieter and more complicated, not disappointment, more like the specific feeling of an enormous thing finishing, the settling of a structure that has been under load for a very long time, finally reaching its resting state. It was over, in the way that things like this are over. Not cleanly, not completely. There would be years of legal proceedings and appeal and the long grinding work of accountability being apportioned and paid. But the core of it was done. Warren Pinnacle III was in federal custody with charges that carried consequences his lawyers could not talk away. The bridge was closed. The evidence was in the hands of people who could use it. Henry Cole's decade of documentation had reached the destination he had built it for. I sat in the light of the generator-powered lamps and looked at the walls around me, and I thought about Henry working down here alone in this same light building, these same walls, and I said his name out loud. to the empty room. Just said it, not as a prayer, not as a declaration, just as an acknowledgement. He was gone and I would never know him the way I should have been allowed to know him. And that loss was real and permanent, and nothing that had happened in the past weeks changed it. But he was here too, in every joint and surface of this place, in the quilts on the beds, in the books on the shelves, in the generator that still hummed, in the ventilator that still cycled, in the deep constant temperature of air that had been sealed away from the changing weather above and had found its own steady equilibrium. He was here. Carol Briggs came to Grover's Hollow herself to deliver the settlement documentation. She drove out on a Saturday in early December, her sedan managing the service road with considerably more difficulty than Dale Marsh's had, though she made no comment about it. She carried a thick envelope that contained the settlement agreement, the deed to the property cleared of all encumbrances and challenges, and the formal legal acknowledgement that Henry Cole's claims had been validated by the investigation and that Pinnacle Group's conduct had been found to constitute the violations he had documented. She also carried something else. She set the envelope on Henry's coffee table, and then from her briefcase she took a smaller envelope. It was old, the paper soft with age, the kind of softness that comes from years of handling or years of storage in a place where the humidity was not quite controlled. The address on the front was a rural route number in Ohio. The return address was a house in Pittsburgh that had since been vacated and sold. "This was in a box of files from your grandfather's estate," Carol said. "The attorneys found it when they were inventorying the remaining property. It was addressed to him, but it had never been opened." She held it toward me carefully, the way you hold something that might be fragile in ways that are not immediately visible. "The handwriting on the envelope is not his." I took it. The handwriting was my mother's. I knew it from years of refrigerator notes and school forms and the cards she had written me for my 10th birthday, the last birthday she was alive, for a card I had kept in the same shoebox as Henry's bridge card until both of them were lost in the moves. I knew it from memory, the way you know certain handwriting, not from active recollection, but from some deeper register where the important things get stored without being asked to. Carol Briggs left quietly with the particular tact of someone who understands when a room needs to contain only one thing. I read it alone that night. Wren was asleep in her room. The tunnel was in its nighttime quiet, the generator on low, the ventilator on its slow cycle. I sat on Henry's couch under the painted sky with the battery-powered lamp beside me, and I opened my mother's letter. It was not a long letter, but it contained everything. She wrote, "Dad, I know I said terrible things. I know I hurt you, and I know I did it because I was scared, and because I did not understand what you were fighting, and because I took my fear out on the person who deserved it least. I was wrong. I have been wrong for a long time, and I have known it for longer than I have been willing to admit it." She wrote, "I have been reading about Pinnacle Group. Not from you, not from anything you sent me, because I told myself I did not want to know. But the information found me anyway, the way truths find you when you have been avoiding them long enough. I understand now what you were trying to do. I understand what it cost you. I understand that you were right." She wrote, "I am sorry I did not believe you. I am sorry that I let my fear make me treat your courage like a problem. I am sorry that I let years go by, years that belonged to you and to the girls and to all of us. And I cannot get those years back, but I can say that I am sorry for them." She wrote, "I want the girls to know you. I want them to understand who their grandfather really is. Not the version I gave them, the closed door. The silence, the real version. The man who spent 20 years trying to tell the truth because he believed the truth was worth the cost. I am going to bring them to Pennsylvania this summer. We will sit on your porch, wherever your porch is, and we will start over. I love you, Dad. I have always loved you, even when I was too scared and too stubborn to show it. Please forgive me. Your daughter." At the bottom of the page, a date. 3 weeks before the accident. 3 weeks before a drunk driver ran a red light on a Tuesday evening in Ohio and took my mother and father in a moment so random and so complete that there was nothing to understand about it and nothing to do with it except carry it. She had written this letter. She had written it, the whole of it, the apology and the love and the plan to come to Pennsylvania and sit on a porch and start over. And she had set it down somewhere in the house in Ohio, intending to address it and send it. And she had not yet done those things when the Tuesday came. Tomorrow, maybe, when the day settled, when the kids were in bed and there was a quiet moment to find the right envelope and write the address carefully and put it in the outgoing mail with the intention it deserved. Tomorrow never came. Henry Cole never knew. He had gone into the tunnel and worked through the evenings and the weekends of 10 full years without ever knowing that his daughter had written this letter, without ever knowing that she had found her way back to him, that she had read the right things and arrived at the truth about what he had sacrificed and why, that she had made her peace with it and was planning to bring his granddaughters to him in the summer. He had built the tunnel on faith, on nothing but faith, on the conviction that love, even love that has been long separated and complicated and silenced by fear and circumstance, has a destination, that it will find its way if you give it time and give it something to find its way to. He had been right about that too. He was right about everything in the end. I sat on the couch in the home he had built, and I held my mother's letter, and I felt the full weight of everything it contained, everything that had been lost, and everything that had somehow, against all reason, found its way here anyway, across all the years and all the distance, and all the closed doors and the silence. They were both gone, but they had loved each other. In the end, under everything, they had loved each other. And that love had been looking for a way back to itself all along, and it had found it even if the finding came too late for either of them to hold. The spring came slowly that year, the way springs come in Pennsylvania, reluctantly in stages, the cold releasing its grip in increments rather than all at once. We built the cabin in April. Ray Birch organized it. I did not ask him to. I woke one Saturday morning to the sound of truck engines on the service road, and I came up through the steel door into morning air that smelled of thaw and new mud and sawdust, and there were 7 men standing on Henry's property with tool belts and a truck full of lumber, and the easy, unhurried energy of people who have shown up to do a thing they know how to do. Ray was among them, directing with the economy of a man accustomed to physical work organized around practical outcomes. He did not explain the operation to me. He handed me a list of tasks and pointed me to the lumber pile, and that was the entire orientation. Dorothy Marsh arrived at noon with sandwiches and opinions. The opinions were directed primarily at the framing of the east-facing windows, which she felt were insufficiently generous, and at the placement of the kitchen counter, which she argued from first principles should be shifted 18 inches to allow for better natural light. She was almost certainly right about both, and the men adjusted without significant argument, which suggested they had worked with Dorothy before and understood the efficiency of simply accepting her corrections. The postmaster from the Grover's Hollow post office showed up in the afternoon with a set of curtains his late wife had made for a room in their house that had since changed purposes. He did not say much about it. He carried them in folded over his arm and offered them to me with the direct simplicity of someone giving a thing they want given, and I took them with the direct simplicity of someone who understands how to receive something that costs the giver more than it appears. The woman who had owned the diner, which was in the process of being renovated back into something functional, drove up the service road at 4 o'clock with an apple pie wrapped in a dish towel and a level assessment of the progress that suggested she had built things herself at some point in her life. People kept arriving through the afternoon. Some of them I recognized from the store or the post office or the gradual process of becoming a familiar face in a place that takes its time with familiarity. Some of them I had never seen before, people who had known Henry from years back, people who had simply heard about what was happening and decided to come the way people in small communities sometimes decide that a thing is theirs to participate in even when they have not been formally invited. Wren worked beside me the whole day. She carried lumber and held boards in place and passed tools with the efficiency of someone paying close attention to what was needed, and she worked with the focused presence she brought to everything she cared about. And at some point in the late afternoon, with the frame up and the roof beginning to take shape against the sky, I noticed that she was humming, soft, almost inaudible, a sound that came and went with her breath that might have been almost anything except that it was clearly organized, clearly intentional, and clearly the evidence of an interior state expressing itself outward in the only way available to it. She was humming. I had not heard that sound from her in 7 years. I kept working. I did not look at her directly, did not make any gesture toward the sound or acknowledgement of it, because I understood instinctively that direct attention might stop it, that it needed the space of being unobserved to continue. I just held the board I was holding and kept it steady and listened to my sister hum in the afternoon light of an April Saturday on a piece of ground that was ours. The cabin was small, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living room with windows on the east side that Dorothy had correctly identified needed to be generous to catch the morning light, a porch facing the tree line where the rail tracks disappeared into the woods. It was simple and well built, and it smelled of new wood and spring air. And when we walked through it that evening in the last of the daylight, it felt like something that had always been waiting to exist in this exact place. Beneath the new wooden floors, beneath the framing and the insulation and the concrete foundation that Ray had insisted on, even when I suggested the cost might be prohibitive. And he had made clear without many words that the cost was not my concern. That morning the steel door remained, flush with the concrete, sealed, waiting. We would always keep the tunnel. It was ours in a way that nothing above ground quite managed to be. It was where we had found the letter, where Wren had first begun to paint, where we had sat together on cold concrete stairs and wept and found something on the other side of the weeping that was stronger than what the weeping came from. The cabin was home. The tunnel was the foundation of home, the hidden bedrock of it, the place that existed before everything else and would exist after everything else, and held the whole structure up in ways that were not visible from above. We would not fill it in or seal it off or pretend it had not happened. It was part of us now, part of the story. You do not demolish your own foundation because you have learned to live above ground. It was a morning in early May when it happened. The spring had finally committed itself. The trees along the rail line had come fully into leaf, and the light through them was the particular light of new leaves, green and interior and full of movement. The light that is specific to that brief window after the gray of winter and before the density of full summer. Wren was in the yard. She had found some perennials in the general store, small root-bound things in plastic pots that the owner had marked down because they had been there too long and needed to go in the ground before they gave up entirely. She was planting them along the front of the porch steps, working with her hands in the new soil, pressing the roots down and firming the earth around them with the particular attention she gave to everything she cared about. She had leaves in her hair. There was soil on her hands and on the knees of her jeans, and on one side of her face where she had brushed away a strand of hair with a dirty hand without noticing. The sun was warm on her back, and the shadows of the new leaves moved across the ground around her, and she was working in the easy, unhurried way of someone doing something that asks nothing of them except their presence. And she was humming, more clearly than the week before, more sustained. A real melody now low and soft, something I did not recognize but that had an internal logic, a phrase that developed and returned something she had made rather than remembered. She tamped the soil down around the last plant and sat back on her heels and looked at what she had done, the small row of not yet established but genuinely planted things along the base of the porch. She seemed satisfied with it, the satisfaction of completion of work that has produced something visible and real. She looked up at me. I was standing on the porch with a cup of coffee, and I had been there for a while watching without intruding, doing the thing I had always done with her silence, which was give it room and not press against it and trust it to know its own terms. Her eyes met mine, her lips moved. The sound was small, barely more than breath with shape, soft and rough at the same time, the specific quality of a mechanism that has not been used in a long time operating for the first time, the way hinges sound when they are opened after years of being closed. One word, home. I did not breathe. I did not move. I stood on the porch with my coffee cup and felt the world rearrange itself around a single syllable in my sister's voice, a voice I had not heard in 7 years, and I understood with the absolute certainty of something that does not require confirmation that what I was hearing was real. She said it again, stronger the second time, clearer. The rough quality smoothing slightly as if the word itself was helping to restore the passage it traveled through. The way water reopens a channel that has been dry. Home. And then she smiled. Not the careful smile she used in public, the one that acknowledged without committing. Not the faint expression that served as a smile when one was required by social circumstance. A real smile, full and unhesitating, the smile of someone who means it with their whole face, who has something to smile about that is large enough to need the whole face to contain it. I sat down on the porch steps. I could not stand anymore. Not because of weakness, but because sitting felt more appropriate to the moment, closer to the ground, closer to the level of the thing that had just happened, which was everything, which was all of it, which was 7 years of silence, ending with a single word in the May morning light on a piece of ground that was ours. She came and sat beside me on the steps. We did not speak. She had said what needed to be said, and it sat between us in the spring air and meant all the things it meant, which were more than one word could contain, and exactly as much as one word needed to be. I thought about Henry Cole. I think about him often even now. I think about him in the way you think about someone who shaped everything that came after, even though you never knew them the way you should have been allowed to, never sat across a table from them or asked them the questions you would have asked, never had the ordinary accumulation of time together that becomes in retrospect the substance of knowing someone. I think about him working alone in the tunnel, not as an abstraction, specifically with the particular vivid quality that comes from having stood in the space he built and breathed the air he sealed in and slept under the quilts he chose. I think about the evenings and the weekends of 10 years, the generator running, the tools organized on the pegboard, the walls going up a course at a time, each concrete block placed by his hands mortared and leveled and left to cure before the next one. What did he think about down there alone? I think he thought about us. I think he thought about two little girls he was not allowed to see, growing up in houses that were not homes, moving from one temporary situation to the next, carrying what they owned in garbage bags. I think he built the cots and chose the quilts and stacked the blank notebooks with specific images in mind. Specific versions of us that he had constructed from photographs and inference and the fierce creative labor of love that has nowhere to go but imagination. I think he was afraid sometimes that he would die before the work was finished, or that he would finish and no one would come, or that someone would come and find the place and it would not be enough, that what he had built would fall short of what was needed, that the gap between what love can build and what people need would prove unbridgeable. He was afraid of the right things and he kept working anyway. That is what I come back to in the end. Not the heroism of it, though it was heroic. Not the injustice of it, though the injustice was real and enormous and cost everyone it touched more than they should have had to pay. What I come back to is simpler than either of those things. He was afraid. He was alone. He had every reason to stop, and he kept building. The $5 key sits in a glass case on the mantle of the cabin now. I put it there the day we moved in, and I have not moved it since. It sits in a small case with a glass top that Ray Birch made from scraps left over from the cabin framing, fitted together with the precision of a man who does not do anything carelessly, and it catches the morning light from the east-facing windows in a way that makes the old brass glow. $5, less than a cup of coffee, less than a gallon of gas. Purchased 30 years ago at a hardware store whose name Henry never bothered to note because the key was the thing and the store was incidental. And he knew even then, when he brought it home and turned it in the lock he had installed in the steel door of the tunnel he was building for grandchildren he might never see, that its value had nothing to do with what he had paid for it. The value of a thing is not what you pay for it. It is what it opens. This key opened a door. That door opened onto a tunnel. That tunnel became a home. And that home gave us the only thing that had ever really been missing. Not money, not property, not any of the material things that the system had failed to provide and Pinnacle Group had tried to take. Something older and more structural than any of those things. A place to stand, a foundation built by a man who understood, in the deepest and most practical part of himself, the part that had designed bridges and understood load tolerances, and knew the difference between a structure that would hold and one that would eventually fail, that some things need to be built to last longer than the people who build them. Some things need to be built for the people who come after. Ren is 16 now. She does not speak often. But when she does, every word carries the particular weight of something that has not been cheapened by overuse, something that has been kept and considered and chosen. She is taking art classes at the community center in Grover's Hollow, and her paintings hang in the coffee shop on the main street, and people drive from other towns to see them. The woman who runs the coffee shop told me that someone offered to buy one of them for more money than I want to repeat here, and that Ren had considered for a long moment and then declined and had not explained why and had not needed to. I am 19. I am enrolled in the community college in the next county over studying pre-law. Carol Briggs has offered me an internship at her firm for the summer. You have good instincts, she told me, and you have something that most people who go into law spend years trying to develop and many never manage. You understand what it costs people when the systems that are supposed to protect them fail. That understanding makes you useful. I accepted. Some mornings I go down through the steel door before the day begins, just for a little while, to sit in the living area in the light of the battery-powered lamp and look at Ren's murals, which have grown and changed over the months as she has continued to work on them, the sky deeper and more complex now, the trees more detailed, the birds more various, a whole world built on the curved walls of a tunnel that a man spent 10 years filling with love in the only form he could give it. I bring a cup of coffee and I sit on the worn couch and I look at what he built and what she made of what he built, and I think about the full length of it. The 30 years from a key purchased at a hardware store to a girl sitting on a porch step in May saying a single word in a voice that had been silent for 7 years. The full arc of it all, the choices and the quiz, and the terrible patience required to maintain faith across that much time and that much distance and that much loss. Henry Cole never got to see this. He never sat on the porch he built in his mind across 10 years of solitary work. He never heard Ren say anything. He never knew his daughter had forgiven him. He never got to hold the key on the outside of the door and know that it had done what he made it to do. I hold that grief carefully because it is real and it matters. And then I hold something else alongside it. He built this place without knowing if it would ever be found, without any certainty that the people he built it for would receive it, without any guarantee that the love he was pouring into concrete and salvaged lumber and carefully chosen quilts and blank notebooks would ever reach the people it was intended for. He built it anyway, because he understood the way engineers understand load tolerances, the way certain people understand certain things at the level where knowledge becomes conviction, that love does not require a guaranteed destination. That faith is not faith if it only operates in conditions of certainty. He built on faith. We are standing on it. And some mornings, when the light comes through the east windows of the cabin, we built on the land that someone spent 10 years making worthy of us. And Ren is humming something in the kitchen while she makes coffee and the old brass key catches the morning light in its glass case on the mantel. I think about a man standing in a hardware store 30 years ago, turning a simple brass key over in his hands, already beginning to understand what it would open. Not a door, everything.